In our journey through history, we drift into the vast, ancient narrative of a family whose reach extended across continents, whose power shaped the very boundaries of nations, and whose legacy still echoes through the grand palaces and quiet corridors of European history. This is the story of the Habsburg Dynasty, a lineage that rose from the mists of medieval Switzerland to become the most enduring and influential royal family the world has ever known. Whether you're discovering us for the first time or returning for another journey through history, thank you for being here. If you enjoy these long-form narratives designed for sleep, please subscribe. We release new historical deep dives each week. Now, settle into comfort, let your mind quiet, and allow us to carry you back through 6 centuries of European history. For more than 600 years, the Habsburgs sat upon thrones, ruled empires, and forged alliances that would determine the fate of millions. Theirs was not primarily a story of conquest by sword, though battles were fought and wars were waged. Instead, the Habsburgs perfected a different art, a more subtle and lasting form of expansion. They married, they negotiated, they collected crowns the way others collected jewels, building an empire not through blood spilled on battlefields, but through carefully arranged unions in candlelit chapels. As you settle into this long night's journey, allow yourself to be carried back through the centuries. We will walk through the cold stone halls of medieval castles, stand in the shadow of the great double-headed eagle, and witness the rise and fall of empires. The pace will be gentle, the details rich, and the story comprehensive. Let the weight of history become a comfort, a soft blanket of names and dates and distant places that carries you deeper into rest. The Habsburgs ruled from Vienna and Madrid, from Brussels and Prague. Their empire, at its height, was so vast that it was said the sun never set upon their domains. Yet they began in the most humble of circumstances, in a small castle in what is now Switzerland, with ambitions no greater than those of any other minor noble family of the age. How they rose from such modest beginnings to such extraordinary heights is a tale of patience, strategy, and an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at precisely the right moment in history. So close your eyes, if you wish. Let your breathing slow and deepen. We have hours ahead of us, and there is no need to rush. The Habsburgs themselves never rushed. They waited, they planned, and they endured. And tonight we will trace every step of their remarkable journey, from the first rough-hewn stones of their ancestral castle to the final tragic gunshot that echoed through Sarajevo and brought their world crashing down. Chapter 1. The Humble Beginnings, from Swiss counts to Austrian dukes. The story begins, as so many great stories do, in obscurity. In the rolling hills and dense forests of what is now northwestern Switzerland, in a region known as Aargau, there stood a modest fortification. It was not particularly grand, not especially imposing. It was simply a castle, one of hundreds that dotted the European landscape in the early medieval period. But this castle had a name that would echo through the centuries: Habsburg, which meant, in the old Germanic tongue, Hawk's Castle. The first mention of this fortress appears in documents from the early 11th century, around the year 1020. The family that built it, and took its name, was minor nobility, vassals of greater lords, administrators of small parcels of land. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable. The Counts of Habsburg served their overlords dutifully, managed their estates competently, and raised their children to do the same. Generation followed generation in the comfortable obscurity of minor nobility. For more than 2 centuries, the Habsburgs remained in this humble station. They witnessed the great movements of their age from a distance, the crusades that drew knights eastward to reclaim the Holy Land, the investiture conflicts between popes and emperors, the slow crystallization of the feudal order that would define medieval Europe. Through it all, the Habsburgs watched, waited, and survived. Survival, it would turn out, was their greatest talent. The family's fortunes began to shift in the 13th century during a period of chaos and opportunity in the Holy Roman Empire. This vast, sprawling entity, which encompassed much of Central Europe, was the ghost of Charlemagne's empire, a complex web of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities nominally united under an elected emperor. The imperial throne had fallen vacant in 1250 with the death of Frederick II, and for more than 2 decades, no strong emperor emerged. This period, known as the Great Interregnum, was a time when the great noble families of Germany tore at each other, each seeking to advance their own interests in the absence of central authority. Into this chaos stepped Rudolf of Habsburg, a man of middle years, experienced in the wars and politics of his time, but still, by the standards of the great princes, a relatively minor figure. Rudolf was elected King of the Romans in 1273, a surprising choice by the prince-electors who preferred a candidate they thought they could control, a man without the resources to threaten their own independence. They underestimated him profoundly. Rudolf was 55 years old when he received the crown, an advanced age for the 13th century. He was tall, with a long, weathered face and the bearing of a man who had spent years in the saddle, managing estates and fighting in petty conflicts. He had served as a military commander, an administrator, and a diplomat. He knew the value of patience and the importance of choosing the right moment to act. And he understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that true power came not from a title, but from land. The Habsburg lands at this point were still modest, scattered holdings in Switzerland and the surrounding regions. But Rudolf had his eye on a far greater prize: the Duchy of Austria. This rich territory along the Danube had been ruled by the Przemyslid king Ottokar II of Bohemia, who had seized it during the chaos of the Interregnum. Ottokar was powerful, wealthy, and ambitious, controlling not only Bohemia, but also Moravia, Styria, and other territories. He had refused to recognize Rudolf's election, viewing the new king as an upstart, unworthy of respect. Rudolf moved carefully. He spent 2 years consolidating his position, gathering allies, and building support among the German princes who were growing increasingly wary of Ottokar's power. He framed his challenge to the Bohemian king not as a personal vendetta, but as a legal matter. Ottokar held imperial territories without proper authority. Rudolf demanded their return. When Ottokar refused, war became inevitable. The conflict culminated on August 26, 1278, on the Marchfeld, a broad plain near the Morava River. It was a savage, decisive battle. Rudolf, despite his age, fought alongside his men. The armies clashed in the brutal, chaotic manner of medieval warfare, thousands of armored knights and foot soldiers locked in desperate combat. When the day ended, Ottokar lay dead on the field, and his great domains were broken. Rudolf, ever the pragmatist, did not claim all of Ottokar's lands for himself. He returned Bohemia to Ottokar's son, securing an ally. But Austria, Styria, and Carinthia he kept. These would become the foundation of Habsburg power. In 1282, Rudolf formally invested his sons, Albert and Rudolf, with the Duchy of Austria and the associated territories. This was the moment when the Habsburgs transformed from minor Swiss nobility to major European power brokers. Austria would remain the core of their domains for more than 600 years, the steady, solid foundation upon which they would build an empire. The castle in Switzerland The Hawk's castle would eventually be abandoned, passed to other hands, forgotten. But the name Habsburg, now tied to the great duchy on the Danube, would never be forgotten again. Rudolf himself died in 1291, having secured his family's future, but never having been crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, the final ceremony that would have made his title complete. His son Albert eventually succeeded him as king, though not without opposition. The pattern was set. The Habsburgs would be kings, they would be rulers, but their path would never be easy. Every generation would have to fight, negotiate, and scheme to maintain what had been won. Yet they would prove remarkably adept at this work, developing over the centuries a patient, methodical approach to power that would become their defining characteristic. The early Habsburg Dukes of Austria were not particularly memorable as individuals. They were competent administrators, careful stewards of their territories, builders of alliances through marriage and treaty. They expanded their holdings gradually, acquiring neighboring territories through purchase, inheritance, and occasional military action. They weathered the Black Death in the 14th century, the devastating plague that killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. They navigated the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire, sometimes holding the imperial throne, sometimes supporting other candidates, always ensuring that their family's interests were protected. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Habsburgs had established themselves as one of the great dynasties of Central Europe. They had transformed the Duchy of Austria into a prosperous, well-governed territory. They had built impressive residences, patronized churches and monasteries, and established themselves as defenders of Christendom against threats from the East. Yet they remained, in a sense, a regional power, important but not dominant. The next great leap forward would come through a marriage, the first of many that would define the Habsburg approach to empire building. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Motto. Bella gerunt Ali, tu Felix Austria nube. The phrase that would come to define the Habsburg dynasty was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Bella gerunt Ali, tu Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This was not merely a motto, it was a strategy, a philosophy of power that would prove more durable and effective than any military conquest. While other dynasties exhausted themselves in endless campaigns, while armies marched and cities burned, the Habsburgs quietly accumulated thrones through carefully arranged marriages. They turned the wedding ceremony into an instrument of statecraft, the marriage bed into a battlefield where empires were won without the spilling of blood. The architect of this strategy, the man who truly understood its potential and executed it with brilliant success, was Maximilian I, who ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1493 to 1519. Maximilian was, in many ways, a romantic figure, a man who styled himself as the Last Knight, who loved tournaments and chivalric literature, who commissioned elaborate works of art celebrating his own deeds. But beneath this medieval facade was a thoroughly modern mind, a ruler who understood that the age of the armored knight was passing, and that the future belonged to those who could master the complex arts of diplomacy, finance, and dynastic politics. Maximilian himself was the product of a fortunate marriage. His father, Frederick III, had arranged his union with Mary of Burgundy, the only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. When Mary's father died in battle in 1477, she inherited one of the richest territories in Europe, the Duchy of Burgundy, which included not only the wine-producing regions of eastern France, but also the wealthy, urbanized territories of the Low Countries, modern Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These were lands of prosperous cities, skilled craftsmen, and thriving trade. The marriage brought the Habsburgs not just territory, but wealth, vast wealth that would fund their ambitions for generations. Mary died tragically young, thrown from her horse in 1482, leaving Maximilian with 2 small children and a contested inheritance. The French king seized the Burgundian heartland in France, but Maximilian held on to the Low Countries, the richest part of the inheritance. He raised his son, Philip, to inherit these territories, and it was through Philip that the next great Habsburg marriage would be arranged, the union that would bring Spain into the family's orbit and transform them into a global power. The target of Maximilian's ambitions was the Iberian Peninsula, where the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united Spain into a single, powerful kingdom. In 1492, these Catholic monarchs had completed the Reconquista, driving the last Muslim rulers from Granada. They had sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage to what would be called the New World. They were, in short, the rising power of Western Europe, wealthy from the gold and silver that would soon flow from the Americas, strong in their faith, ambitious in their vision. Maximilian arranged a double marriage alliance with Spain. His son Philip, known as Philip the Handsome for his striking good looks, would marry Joanna, the second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. At the same time, Maximilian's daughter Margaret would marry Joanna's brother Juan, the heir to the Spanish throne. It seemed, at the time, like a balanced arrangement, a typical dynastic alliance designed to cement friendship between 2 powerful families. Neither side expected that these marriages would result in a union of the 2 dynasties under a single ruler. But fate, that unpredictable force that shapes history in ways no amount of planning can anticipate, intervened repeatedly. Juan, the Spanish heir, died suddenly in 1497, just months after his marriage. His older sister Isabella, who then became heir, died in childbirth in 1498. Her infant son Miguel died in 1500. Suddenly, unexpectedly, Joanna, married to the Habsburg Philip, found herself the heiress to the Spanish throne. When Isabella died in 1504, Joanna inherited Castile. When Ferdinand died in 1516, she inherited Aragon as well. But Joanna never truly ruled. Her story is one of the great tragedies of Habsburg history, a tale that has been told and retold, embellished and mythologized. She was deeply in love with her husband Philip, possessively, obsessively so, and he, handsome and charming, was frequently unfaithful. Their marriage was passionate and turbulent. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, possibly from typhoid fever, Joanna's grief was overwhelming. She refused to allow his body to be buried, traveling with his coffin across Spain, stopping at monasteries and churches, ordering the coffin opened so she could gaze upon his corpse. Her father, Ferdinand, had her declared insane and confined to a convent in Tordesillas, where she would remain for the rest of her long life, 50 years of captivity. Whether she was truly mad or merely inconvenient to the men who sought to rule in her name has been debated by historians ever since. What is certain is that she never ruled. Instead, her son Charles, born in 1500 in the Flemish city of Ghent, would inherit everything: Spain, the Spanish territories in Italy, the Low Countries, Austria, and, in time, the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Before we follow Charles to his magnificent and overwhelming inheritance, we must appreciate the magnitude of what Maximilian had achieved. Through a series of marriages, through careful negotiation and sheer good fortune, he had positioned his grandson to inherit not one empire but several. The Habsburg strategy of dynastic marriage had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Maximilian died in 1519, just before his grandson was elected emperor. He had lived to see the foundation of Habsburg greatness, but he did not witness its full flowering. That would be left to Charles, who would become the most powerful ruler since Charlemagne, the man who would truly embody the phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets." Yet, even as the Habsburgs accumulated thrones, they also accumulated the problems that came with them. The Spanish kingdoms brought not just wealth from the Americas, but also entanglements in Italian politics, conflicts with France, and the immense burden of defending and administering far-flung territories. The Low Countries brought prosperity, but also independent-minded burghers, and, in time, the fires of religious reformation. Austria brought responsibility for defending the eastern frontiers of Christendom against the Ottoman Turks. And the imperial title, that ancient dignity of the Holy Roman Empire, brought with it the endless, exhausting work of mediating between hundreds of German princes, cities, and prelates, each jealous of their privileges, each resistant to any hint of centralized authority. The Habsburg marriage strategy had won an empire. Now the dynasty would have to learn to rule it, to hold together territories that shared nothing but a common ruler, to balance the demands of different peoples, different languages, different traditions. It was a task that would consume the energy of generations, that would drive some rulers to exhaustion and others to despair. But the Habsburgs would endure, adapting, compromising, always holding on to the central insight that had brought them greatness. That power, true power, came not from dramatic gestures or glorious victories, but from patient accumulation, from strategic marriages, from the slow, steady work of administration and diplomacy. Chapter 3. Charles V, the sun never sets on the empire. In the year 1500, in the prosperous Flemish city of Ghent, a child was born who would inherit the greatest accumulation of territories any European ruler had ever possessed. Charles, the son of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, entered the world as the embodiment of the Habsburg marriage strategy. He was, from birth, the heir to multiple kingdoms, the future ruler of an empire so vast that it defied the imagination of his contemporaries. Charles's childhood was not happy. His father died when he was 6 years old. His mother, declared insane, was confined to her quarters in Tordesillas. He was raised by his Aunt Margaret in the Netherlands, educated by tutors who taught him the languages of his future realms, French, Spanish, German, Latin, though he would never master all of them with equal facility. He was a serious child, solemn and reserved, bearing the weight of his inheritance even before he understood its full extent. The inheritances came in waves. In 1515, at age 15, he became Duke of Burgundy and Lord of the Netherlands, ruler of the wealthiest commercial territories in Europe. In 1516, when his maternal grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon died, Charles became King of Spain, ruling over Castile, Aragon, and the rapidly expanding Spanish territories in the Americas, New Spain, Peru, the Caribbean islands, vast regions that were only beginning to be explored and exploited. In 1519, when his paternal grandfather Maximilian died, Charles became Archduke of Austria and was elected Holy Roman Emperor, taking the title Charles V. At 19 years old, Charles ruled over territories that stretched from the Danube to the Americas, from Sicily to the North Sea. His empire encompassed perhaps 40 million subjects, speaking dozens of languages, practicing, increasingly, different forms of Christianity, living under different laws and customs. The Spanish called him Carlos, the Germans called him Karl, the Flemish called him Karel. He was all of these and none of them, a universal ruler in an age that was rapidly discovering that universality was impossible. The challenges Charles faced were immense. To the west, the Kingdom of France, ruled by the ambitious Francis I, felt surrounded and threatened by Habsburg power. French territories were now bordered on nearly all sides by Charles's domains. Spain to the south, the Low Countries to the north, the Holy Roman Empire to the east. The rivalry between Charles and Francis would define the politics of the first half of the 16th century, erupting into repeated wars that devastated Italy, where both rulers had claims and interests. To the east, the Ottoman Empire, under the brilliant and aggressive Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was expanding into Europe. The Ottomans had conquered the Balkans, Hungary, and were threatening Vienna itself. Charles, as Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of Austria, bore the responsibility of defending Christendom against this Islamic threat, a burden that consumed enormous resources and attention. And within his own territories, a new and unexpected challenge was emerging: religious reformation. In 1517, just 2 years before Charles became emperor, a German monk named Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, challenging the practices and doctrines of the Catholic Church. What began as a theological dispute rapidly became a political and social revolution, dividing Germany and eventually all of Europe along religious lines. Charles, raised as a devout Catholic, viewed it as his sacred duty to suppress this heresy and maintain the unity of the Church. But the German princes, many of whom saw in Protestantism an opportunity to assert their independence from both emperor and pope, supported Luther and the movement he had started. Charles spent his reign constantly in motion, traveling from one part of his empire to another, never able to remain in one place long enough to establish a true capital. He would spend a year in Spain, then sail to Italy to confront the French, then travel north to Germany to deal with the Protestant princes, then return to Spain to manage affairs there. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the slow pace of early modern travel and communication. Messages took weeks to travel from Madrid to Vienna, from Brussels to Naples. By the time news reached the emperor, circumstances had often changed. The Italian wars, the long series of conflicts with France over control of Italy, were particularly brutal. In 1525, Charles's forces won a decisive victory at the Battle of Pavia, where Francis IV himself was captured and held prisoner. It seemed like a triumph, but the victory brought no lasting peace. When Francis was released, he immediately resumed the conflict. In 1527, Charles's troops, unpaid and mutinous, sacked Rome itself, the holy city, in one of the most traumatic events of the Renaissance. The Pope was forced to flee, and the prestige of Charles's empire was tarnished by the atrocity, even though it had not been ordered by the emperor. In Germany, Charles tried repeatedly to resolve the religious divisions through negotiation and compromise. He convened the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, hoping to find a middle ground between Catholics and Protestants. When that failed, he resorted to force, fighting the Protestant Schmalkaldic League in a series of campaigns in the 1540s and 1550s. But military victory proved impossible to convert into religious unity. The Protestant princes were too powerful, too determined, and too well supported by France, which was happy to support anyone who weakened the emperor, regardless of religious considerations. The Mediterranean became another front in Charles's wars. Ottoman fleets raided the coasts of Spain and Italy, carrying off thousands of captives into slavery. Barbary pirates operating from North Africa terrorized Christian shipping. Charles organized expeditions to capture Tunis in 1535 and attempted to take Algiers in 1541, but the latter ended in disaster when a storm destroyed much of his fleet. Through all of this, Charles remained personally austere and devout. He did not seek glory for its own sake, did not revel in power or luxury. He saw himself as a servant of God and the Church, burdened with the responsibility of defending Christendom and preserving the unity of the faith. His personal tastes were simple. He preferred plain clothing, enjoyed mechanical clocks and devices, and found solace in music and religious meditation. But the weight of his responsibilities took a terrible toll on his health. He suffered from gout, digestive problems, and what may have been depression. His famous Habsburg jaw, a genetic trait that would become more pronounced in later generations, made eating difficult and may have contributed to his ailments. By the 1550s, Charles was exhausted. He was in his 50s, old for the 16th century, and worn down by decades of constant warfare, travel, and administrative burden. He had failed to achieve his primary goals. The Protestant Reformation had not been suppressed, the Ottoman Turks had not been driven from Europe, and France remained hostile and powerful. His empire, he realized, was too vast for any one man to govern effectively. The problems of Spain and the Netherlands, of Italy and Germany, of the Americas and the Mediterranean were too different, too complex to be managed from a single throne. And so Charles made a decision that was almost unprecedented in the history of monarchy. He abdicated. Between 1555 and 1556, in a series of elaborate ceremonies, Charles gave up his various titles and territories. To his son Philip, he gave Spain, the Netherlands, the Spanish territories in Italy, and the Spanish Empire in the Americas. To his brother Ferdinand, he gave Austria, the Habsburg hereditary lands in Central Europe, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He divided his empire into two, creating what would become the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg Dynasty. In October 1555, in the Great Hall of the Palace in Brussels, Charles formally abdicated as ruler of the Netherlands. It was an emotional ceremony. Charles dressed in black, leaning on the shoulder of William of Orange because his gout made it difficult to stand, addressed the assembled nobles and officials. He spoke of his 40 years of rule, of the 9 wars with France, of the constant struggles against the Ottomans and the Protestants. He spoke of his travels, of crossing the Mediterranean 8 times, the Spanish seas 6 times, and journeying to Germany 9 times. He apologized for his failures and asked forgiveness for his mistakes. Many in the audience wept. After abdicating, Charles retired to a monastery in Yuste, in the remote region of Extremadura in Spain. He did not become a monk himself, but lived in a suite of rooms attached to the monastery, maintaining a small household. He spent his final years in prayer, in reading, in tending to a small garden. He ate simply, though he could not entirely give up his fondness for anchovies and beer. He maintained his interest in clocks, surrounding himself with timepieces of various kinds, adjusting them, comparing them, perhaps finding in their regular mechanical movements a comfort that the chaotic world of politics had never provided. Charles V died on September 21st, 1558, at the age of 58. He had ruled over more territory than any European monarch before him. He had fought wars on 3 continents, confronted the greatest military and religious challenges of his age, and held together for a time an empire that defied all logic and geography. But he had also learned the limits of power, the impossibility of imposing unity on a fractured world. His decision to divide the empire was an acknowledgement of those limits, a recognition that even the most powerful ruler could not hold everything together. The 2 branches of the Habsburg dynasty would henceforth follow separate paths, the Spanish and the Austrian, united by family ties and shared interests but independent in their rule. Each would face different challenges, develop different characteristics, and ultimately meet different fates. But both would carry forward the Habsburg tradition, the patient accumulation of power, the strategic use of marriage, the commitment to Catholic faith, and the understanding that rulership was not a privilege, but a burden to be borne with duty and devotion. Chapter 4. The Great Split, Spanish and Austrian Branches. The division of Charles V's empire between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand marked a pivotal moment in Habsburg history, creating two distinct branches of the dynasty that would coexist for more than 3 centuries. This split was not born of conflict or rivalry, but of practical necessity. The empire Charles had assembled was simply too vast, too diverse, too complex to be governed by a single ruler from a single court. By dividing it along broadly geographical and cultural lines, Charles hoped to create 2 viable realms, each manageable in a way the whole had never been. The Spanish branch, under Philip II, received what many considered the more glittering inheritance. Spain itself, unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, was at the height of its power and wealth. The gold and silver that flowed from the mines of Mexico and Peru were transforming the Spanish economy and making the Spanish crown the wealthiest in Europe. The Spanish territories in Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, Sicily, and Sardinia, gave Philip control over much of the Mediterranean. The Netherlands, that complex of 17 provinces in the Low Countries, provided access to northern European trade networks and the wealth of cities like Antwerp, Bruges, and Amsterdam. And across the Atlantic, the Spanish Empire was expanding rapidly, with conquistadors, missionaries, and settlers claiming vast territories in the name of the Spanish crown. Philip was 30 years old when he inherited this empire, a man who had been carefully prepared for rule. Unlike his father, who had been raised in Flanders and always remained somewhat foreign to his Spanish subjects, Philip was thoroughly Spanish. He had been born in Valladolid, raised in Spain, and educated by Spanish tutors. He spoke Spanish as his first language and always preferred Spanish advisors and customs. Where Charles had been perpetually in motion, traveling constantly between his scattered domains, Philip would establish a permanent capital at Madrid and rarely leave the Iberian Peninsula. His approach to rule was bureaucratic rather than personal, conducted through written correspondence and formal councils rather than through face-to-face meetings and personal relationships. The Austrian branch, under Ferdinand I, received territories that were less wealthy, but perhaps more cohesive. Austria itself, along with the associated territories of Styria, Carinthia, and Tyrol, formed the core of the inheritance. Ferdinand also held Bohemia and Hungary, though the latter was contested and largely occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and he inherited the title of Holy Roman Emperor, that ancient dignity that conveyed prestige but limited actual power. The emperor presided over a bewildering collection of principalities, duchies, free cities, and ecclesiastical territories, each jealous of its independence, each resistant to central authority. Ferdinand had served as his brother's representative in Germany for decades, dealing with the Protestant princes, managing the endless political negotiations that imperial rule required, and organizing the defense against the Ottoman Turks. He was experienced, diplomatic, and pragmatic. Unlike his brother, he was willing to compromise on religious matters, recognizing that the religious unity Charles had dreamed of was no longer achievable. In 1555, he helped negotiate the Peace of Augsburg, which established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. Each German prince could determine whether his territory would be Catholic or Lutheran, and his subjects would be expected to follow suit. It was not the universal Catholic unity that Charles had fought for, but it brought a measure of peace to war-weary Germany. The two branches maintained close ties. They were, after all, family, and the Habsburg commitment to family loyalty was profound. Marriage alliances between the Spanish and Austrian branches were frequent, as the dynasty continued its tradition of marrying within itself to keep power concentrated. Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs exchanged letters regularly, coordinated their policies on major European issues, and generally presented a united front to their rivals. The double-headed eagle, that ancient symbol the Habsburgs had adopted from Byzantine tradition, seemed fitting. One body with two heads, looking in different directions, but sharing a common heart. Yet the split also meant that the two branches developed distinct characters and faced distinct challenges. The Spanish Habsburgs became increasingly identified with militant Catholicism, with the defense of the faith against Protestant heresy and Muslim expansion. They were the champions of the Counter-Reformation, the patrons of the Jesuits, the enforcers of the Inquisition. Their wealth made them the dominant power in European politics, but it also made them a target for rivals and rebels. The Austrian Habsburgs, meanwhile, had to be more flexible, more pragmatic. In the Holy Roman Empire, they ruled over both Catholic and Protestant territories and had to maintain a delicate balance between the two. On their eastern frontiers, they faced constant pressure from the Ottoman Empire, a threat that required all their resources and attention. They could not afford the luxury of religious absolutism or inflexible policies. They learned to negotiate, to compromise, to find middle paths. This pragmatism would become characteristic of the Austrian branch, a flexibility that would allow them to endure long after the Spanish branch had ended. The personalities of the rulers shaped their realms. Philip II of Spain was serious, methodical, deeply religious, and suspicious of innovation or change. He worked long hours at his desk in the Escorial, the massive palace monastery he built north of Madrid, reading reports, writing annotations, making decisions on matters both great and small. He trusted few people and delegated authority reluctantly. He was a micromanager, convinced that only through constant attention to detail could his vast empire be properly governed. Ferdinand IV and his successors in Austria were more outward-looking, more willing to delegate, more comfortable with the messy compromises that political life required. They held court in Vienna, which would become one of the great cultural capitals of Europe. They patronized artists, musicians, and architects. They rebuilt Vienna after the devastation of war, transforming it from a medieval fortress city into a Baroque showpiece. They cultivated relationships with the diverse peoples of their realm, Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, and learned to work within the complex constitutional arrangements that gave each group a voice in governance. The split also had military implications. The Spanish branch focused its military efforts on the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, fighting the Ottomans in naval battles, suppressing revolts in Italy, and eventually becoming entangled in the long, grinding conflict in the Netherlands, where Protestant provinces rebelled against Spanish rule. The Austrian branch concentrated on land warfare in Central and Eastern Europe, defending against Ottoman invasions, putting down rebellions in Bohemia and Hungary, and maintaining the complex balance of power within the Holy Roman Empire. Economically, the two branches took different paths. Spain, awash in American silver, seemed wealthy beyond measure, but this wealth was deceptive. The silver influx caused inflation, undermining Spanish agriculture and manufacturing. Spain became increasingly dependent on imports, and the flow of silver went to pay for these imports and to finance Spain's endless wars. The Spanish economy, despite its apparent wealth, was fundamentally unsound, and by the early 17th century, Spain would declare bankruptcy multiple times. Austria and the hereditary Habsburg lands had no access to American wealth, but they developed more balanced economies. They encouraged manufacturing, protected their agriculture, and managed their finances more conservatively. Vienna became a center of trade between Western and Eastern Europe. The Austrian Habsburgs learned to live within their means, or at least closer to them than their Spanish cousins, and this financial conservatism would contribute to their longevity. The Great Split, then, was not merely an administrative arrangement, but the beginning of two distinct Habsburg stories. Both branches would know glory and tragedy, triumph and defeat. Both would produce remarkable rulers and disappointing ones. Both would shape European history in profound ways. But they would do so separately, each following its own path, until the extinction of the Spanish line would once again bring the question of succession to the forefront of European politics and plunge the continent into war. Chapter 5. The Spanish Golden Age and the Armada's Fall. The late 16th century marked the zenith of Spanish Habsburg power, a period when Spain stood as the preeminent force in European affairs, its wealth, military might, and cultural influence radiating outward from Madrid to touch every corner of the known world. This was the Siglo de Oro, the Golden Age, when Spanish arms seemed invincible, Spanish gold inexhaustible, and Spanish faith unshakable. Yet even at its height, the seeds of decline were being sown, and the catastrophic defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 would mark the beginning of a long, slow erosion of Spanish dominance. Philip II, who ruled Spain from 1556 to 1598, embodied both the strengths and weaknesses of Spanish Habsburg power. He was intelligent, hard-working, and deeply committed to his dual role as king and defender of Catholic Christendom. His personal piety was intense, even by the standards of his age. He heard Mass daily, sometimes twice daily. He kept a collection of holy relics that numbered in the thousands, carefully catalogued and displayed. He saw his political and military struggles not merely as affairs of state, but as sacred duties, battles in a cosmic war between true faith and heresy, between Christian civilization and its enemies. The physical embodiment of Philip's vision was the Escorial, the massive complex he ordered built in the barren hills northwest of Madrid. Construction began in 1563 and continued for more than 2 decades, consuming enormous resources and employing thousands of workers. The result was unlike anything else in Europe. Part palace, part monastery, part mausoleum, part library and archive. It was austere in its architecture, built of gray granite, its lines severe and unadorned. Within its walls were rooms for the royal family, apartments for monks, a great church with a gilded altarpiece, and crypts where Spanish kings would be laid to rest. Philip had a small apartment in the Escorial, modestly furnished compared to the grandeur of other European royal residences. From his study, he could look down into the church and hear the monks singing their daily offices. Here, surrounded by his papers and his relics, working by candlelight late into the night, Philip attempted to govern his global empire. Reports came to him from every corner of his domains, from viceroys in Mexico and Peru, from governors in the Netherlands and Italy, from ambassadors in Rome and Vienna, from military commanders on land and sea. Philip read them all, made notes in the margins, drafted replies in his own hand. No detail seemed too small for his attention, no decision too minor to escape his review. This approach to governance had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, Philip was extraordinarily well informed, aware of problems and opportunities that other monarchs might miss. His archive was magnificent, a repository of information that allowed for careful planning and long-term strategy. On the other hand, the system was agonizingly slow. Decisions that required the king's personal approval took months to make. by which time circumstances had often changed. Philip's micromanagement also meant that his subordinates were reluctant to take initiative, always waiting for instructions from Madrid, always fearing that independent action would be repudiated. The wealth that underwrote Spanish power came primarily from the Americas. The silver mines of Potosi in Peru and Zacatecas in Mexico produced staggering quantities of precious metal. Fleets sailed regularly from the New World to Seville, carrying not just silver, but also gold, pearls, emeralds, and exotic goods. The Casa de Contratación in Seville regulated all trade with the Americas, collecting taxes and ensuring that the crown received its fifth, the quinto real, of all precious metals imported. At the height of silver production, in the late 16th century, millions of pesos worth of silver arrived in Spain each year. Yet this wealth proved more curse than blessing. The massive influx of silver caused severe inflation throughout Europe, but especially in Spain. Prices rose dramatically, making Spanish goods uncompetitive with those produced elsewhere. Spanish agriculture declined as it became cheaper to import grain than to grow it. Spanish manufacturing withered as the wealthy preferred to buy luxurious foreign goods. The silver that arrived in Seville flowed out almost immediately to pay for imports from France, the Netherlands, and Italy, and to finance Spain's military operations across Europe and the Mediterranean. Philip's wars consumed resources at an astounding rate. In the Mediterranean, Spanish galleys fought Ottoman and Barbary corsair fleets in an endless struggle for control of the sea lanes. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Holy League fleet commanded by Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother, defeated a large Ottoman fleet, was celebrated throughout Christian Europe as a great triumph. The church bells of every Catholic city rang in celebration, and artists commemorated the victory in paintings and poems. Yet the strategic impact was limited. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year, and the struggle in the Mediterranean continued. In the Netherlands, Philip faced an even more intractable problem. The 17 provinces of the Low Countries had prospered under Habsburg rule, but they were also proud of their local liberties and traditions. When Philip attempted to strengthen royal authority, enforce religious uniformity, and introduce the Spanish Inquisition, the provinces erupted in revolt. What began in 1566 as protests and iconoclastic riots escalated into a full-scale war of independence that would drag on for 80 years. The Dutch Revolt, as it became known, was both a religious and political struggle. The northern provinces, influenced by Calvinist preachers, rejected Catholic authority entirely. The southern provinces, more Catholic in their sympathies, still resented Spanish rule and heavy taxation. Philip sent army after army to suppress the rebellion, commanded by some of Spain's finest generals, the Duke of Alba, Don Juan of Austria, the Duke of Parma. These forces won battles, captured cities, and executed rebel leaders. But the revolt continued, fueled by hatred of Spanish tyranny, by religious conviction, and by support from Spain's enemies, particularly England and France. The war in the Netherlands drained Spanish resources and became a running sore that never healed. The Army of Flanders, as the Spanish forces there were known, was the finest military force in Europe, disciplined, experienced, and seemingly invincible in open battle. Yet it could not suppress the rebellion. The geography of the Netherlands, with its network of rivers, canals, and fortified cities, favored the defenders. The Dutch rebels, calling themselves the Sea Beggars, used small, maneuverable ships to raid Spanish supply lines and coastal towns, and the expense of maintaining tens of thousands of soldiers far from Spain, supplying them across hostile territory or by sea, was staggering. Philip's hatred of Protestant heresy was matched by his hostility toward Protestant England. Queen Elizabeth I, who had come to the throne in 1558, re-established Protestantism as England's official religion and positioned herself as the champion of Protestant Europe. English ships raided Spanish shipping in the Caribbean, stealing treasure and disrupting trade. English privateers, operating with the Queen's tacit approval, attacked Spanish ports and supply lines. England supported the Dutch rebels with money and troops, and English Catholics, who still hoped for a restoration of their faith, looked to Philip as their potential liberator. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587, a Catholic claimant to the English throne who had been imprisoned by Elizabeth for nearly 20 years, finally pushed Philip to action. He had long contemplated an invasion of England, but the enterprise was complex and risky. Now he committed to it fully, ordering the preparation of a great fleet, an armada, that would sail from Spain to the Netherlands, collect the army of Flanders, and transport it across the Channel to invade England. The preparations took more than a year and consumed vast resources. Ships were requisitioned from all over the Spanish Empire and from allied Portugal, which Philip had inherited in 1580. Supplies were gathered: cannons, gunpowder, shot, provisions for thousands of sailors and soldiers. The fleet that finally sailed from Lisbon in May 1588 numbered more than 130 ships, carrying perhaps 30,000 men. It was commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, an experienced administrator but not a naval commander, who accepted the position reluctantly, protesting that he knew nothing of the sea and was prone to seasickness. The story of the Armada has been told countless times, becoming part of English national mythology and a symbol of Spanish decline. The Spanish fleet sailed up the English Channel in a great defensive crescent formation, harried by English ships commanded by Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Lord Howard of Effingham. The English ships were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the Spanish galleons. They used their longer-range guns to stand off and pound the Spanish fleet without coming within boarding range, where Spanish numbers and soldiers would have given them the advantage. The Spanish plan was to reach the Netherlands, rendezvous with the Army of Flanders under the Duke of Parma, and transport those veteran troops to England. But coordination failed. Parma's barges were blockaded by Dutch ships and could not reach the rendezvous point. The Armada anchored off Calais, waiting, and while they waited, the English sent in fire ships, old vessels filled with combustibles and set ablaze, allowed to drift toward the Spanish fleet on the wind and tide. The Spanish, terrified of these floating bombs, cut their anchor cables and scattered in disorder. The Battle of Gravelines followed, a chaotic engagement in which the English pressed their advantage, firing into the scattered Spanish ships. The Armada's formations dissolved, and the Spanish commander made the fateful decision to abandon the invasion attempt and return to Spain by sailing north around Scotland and Ireland, avoiding the English Channel altogether. This route took the battered, storm-damaged fleet into the worst of the Atlantic's fury. Ship after ship was driven onto the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland, wrecked by storms that seemed to confirm divine displeasure with the Spanish enterprise. Of the 130 ships that had sailed from Spain, fewer than 70 returned. Perhaps 15,000 men were lost, drowned in storms, or killed in battle. Philip received the news of the disaster with characteristic stoicism. "I sent the Armada against men, not against the winds and waves," he is reported to have said. He ordered the preparation of another fleet, refusing to accept defeat. And indeed, Spain remained formidable. The treasure fleets continued to arrive from America. The Army of Flanders continued to fight in the Netherlands. Spanish power in Italy and the Mediterranean remained strong. But the aura of invincibility was shattered. The failure of the Armada emboldened Spain's enemies, and showed that the Spanish colossus could be challenged and defeated. The last decade of Philip's reign was marked by declining health and mounting problems. The king suffered from gout so severe that he could barely move, from ulcers and infections that caused constant pain. He retreated more and more into the Escorial, into his small apartment with its view of the church, spending his days in prayer and paperwork. The war in the Netherlands dragged on. France, torn by its own religious wars, remained unstable but hostile. The cost of maintaining Spanish power everywhere was becoming unsustainable. In 1596, Philip was forced to declare bankruptcy for the third time in his reign, suspending payments to his creditors and disrupting the entire Spanish financial system. Philip II died on September 13, 1598, after weeks of agony from infected ulcers and bed sores. He was 71 years old and had ruled for 42 years. His body was placed in the royal crypt beneath the Escorial, where it remains to this day. He had been a diligent, conscientious ruler, utterly committed to his duties and his faith. But his legacy was mixed. He had maintained Spanish power at its zenith, but at enormous cost. He had defended Catholic Christianity with unwavering conviction, but had failed to suppress Protestantism. He had left his son, Philip III, an empire that was still vast and wealthy, but one that was also burdened with debt, locked in expensive wars, and beginning its long, slow decline from the golden heights of the 16th century toward the diminished status it would occupy in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Spanish Golden Age would continue in culture and the arts even as Spanish political power waned. This was the age of Cervantes and Lope de Vega, of Velázquez and El Greco, of architectural splendors and literary masterpieces. The Spanish language spread across the globe, from the Philippines to Peru. Spanish culture influenced Europe profoundly. But the military and political dominance that had characterized Philip II's reign would never be fully recaptured. The defeat of the Armada marked a turning point, the moment when Spanish Habsburg power, having reached its peak, began its long, gradual descent. Chapter 6. The 30 Years' War. The Habsburgs and the End of an Era. The 17th century opened with Europe still reeling from the religious divisions of the Reformation, divisions that the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had tried to contain but never resolved. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio had brought a measure of peace to the Holy Roman Empire, but it was an unstable peace, built on mutual exhaustion rather than genuine reconciliation. By 1618, the tensions that had been building for decades finally exploded into the most devastating conflict Europe had yet experienced. The 30 Years' War, a catastrophe that would transform the political and religious landscape of Central Europe and mark the beginning of the end for Habsburg dreams of universal Catholic monarchy. The war began, as so many wars do, with a relatively minor incident that spiraled out of control. In Prague, capital of Bohemia, Protestant nobles were increasingly alarmed by the policies of the Habsburg King Ferdinand, who was both King of Bohemia and heir to the Austrian Habsburg domains. Ferdinand was an intolerant Catholic, educated by Jesuits, convinced that his primary duty was to restore religious uniformity to his territories. The Bohemian nobility, predominantly Protestant, saw their religious freedoms and political privileges under threat. On May 23, 1618, a group of Protestant nobles confronted two of Ferdinand's Catholic counselors in the Hradčany Palace in Prague. After a heated argument, the nobles seized the counselors and hurled them out of a window. This defenestration of Prague, as it became known, might have been merely an embarrassing incident. The counselors survived, landing in a pile of manure. But instead it became the spark that ignited 3 decades of war. The Bohemian nobles deposed Ferdinand and elected a Protestant king, Frederick V of the Palatinate, the son-in-law of King James I of England. But Ferdinand, who in 1619 became Holy Roman Emperor as Ferdinand II, was not prepared to accept the loss of Bohemia. He gathered an army, supported by Spanish Habsburg forces and by Catholic German princes, and marched on Bohemia. In November 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain just outside Prague, Ferdinand's forces crushed the Bohemian army. Frederick fled into exile, where he would remain for the rest of his life, earning the mocking title, the Winter King, for his brief reign. Ferdinand exacted a terrible revenge on Bohemia, executing rebel leaders, confiscating Protestant estates, and forcibly re-Catholicizing the kingdom. But the war did not end with Ferdinand's victory in Bohemia. Instead, it spread, drawing in more and more powers, transforming from a local rebellion into a general European conflict. The reasons were complex, a mixture of religious conviction, political ambition, and strategic calculation. Protestant states feared Habsburg power and Catholic militancy. France, though Catholic, was more concerned with Habsburg encirclement and was willing to support Protestant princes to weaken the Habsburgs. Sweden, under its brilliant warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, intervened to protect German Protestantism and to expand Swedish influence in the Baltic. The war moved through distinct phases, each named for the primary combatants: the Bohemian phase, the Danish phase, the Swedish phase, and finally the French phase. Each phase brought new devastation. Armies marched back and forth across Germany, living off the land, which meant plundering the countryside, burning towns, and reducing the peasantry to starvation. The armies themselves were massive, consisting not just of soldiers but of vast trains of camp followers, wives, children, prostitutes, merchants, servants. An army of 20,000 soldiers might be accompanied by another 40,000 non-combatants, all of whom needed food, shelter, and supplies. The methods of warfare were brutal even by the standards of the age. Siege warfare was particularly savage, with cities holding out for months while their populations starved. When a city fell by assault rather than surrender, it was customary for the victorious army to plunder it thoroughly, and massacres of civilians were common. The sack of Magdeburg in 1631 by Catholic forces resulted in the deaths of perhaps 20,000 people and left the city a smoking ruin. Such atrocities, committed by both sides, poisoned relations between communities and left hatreds that would endure for generations. The Austrian Habsburgs, under Ferdinand II and his son Ferdinand III, fought desperately to maintain their position. They saw the war not merely as a political struggle, but as a religious crusade, a final chance to roll back the Protestant Reformation and restore Catholic unity to the empire. Ferdinand II's military commander, Albrecht von Wallenstein, built a massive army, funded by extracting contributions from occupied territories. Wallenstein was a military genius and a ruthless opportunist, loyal to no one but himself, willing to negotiate with both sides, eventually suspected of treason by Ferdinand and assassinated on the emperor's orders in 1634. The entry of Sweden into the war in 1630 transformed the military balance. Gustavus Adolphus was one of the great commanders of the age, a tactical innovator who understood the use of mobile artillery and combined arms. His forces swept through northern Germany, winning victory after victory, threatening Vienna itself. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Swedish forces decisively defeated the imperial army, showing that the Habsburgs were not invincible. Gustavus Adolphus died in battle at Lutzen in 1632, but Swedish forces remained a major factor in the conflict for years to come. France, under the direction of Cardinal Richelieu, entered the war openly in 1635, despite being Catholic. Richelieu's logic was purely political. Habsburg power, whether Spanish or Austrian, threatened French interests and had to be checked. French armies invaded the Spanish Netherlands, northern Italy, and the Rhineland. Spanish and French forces fought each other along the Spanish-French border. The conflict became truly international, with battles fought from the Baltic to Italy, from the Rhineland to Catalonia. The war ground on, year after year, becoming a seemingly endless nightmare. Entire regions of Germany were depopulated. Farms were abandoned, fields returned to wilderness, villages disappeared. Disease followed the armies: plague, typhus, dysentery. Famine was widespread as agricultural production collapsed. The psychological trauma was immense, creating a sense that the apocalypse had arrived, that God had abandoned humanity to suffering and chaos. The population of the Holy Roman Empire, which stood at perhaps 20 million before the war, may have declined by as much as a third or even more in the worst affected regions. By the 1640s, all sides were exhausted. The Habsburg cause was failing. Spanish power was in decline, unable to provide the support the Austrian branch needed. The Protestant princes and their foreign allies, Sweden and France, were gaining the upper hand. Ferdinand III, who had succeeded his father in 1637, recognized that the Habsburg dream of a unified Catholic empire was unattainable. Negotiations began in 1643 in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück, but they dragged on for years as the fighting continued, and the various parties jockeyed for advantage at the negotiating table. The Peace of Westphalia, finally signed in 1648, fundamentally reshaped the political and religious order of Central Europe. The treaties recognized the sovereignty of the individual German states within the Holy Roman Empire, making the emperor's authority largely symbolic. They confirmed the principle of religious freedom, allowing each ruler to determine the religion of his territory and granting toleration to religious minorities. They ceded significant territories. France gained Alsace, Sweden gained territories along the Baltic and North Sea coasts, and the Netherlands and Switzerland had their independence formally recognized. For the Habsburgs, Westphalia was a defeat, though not a catastrophic one. The Austrian branch retained its core territories and maintained the imperial title, which still carried prestige, if little power. But the dream of religious unity was dead. The power of the emperor permanently diminished. The Holy Roman Empire would continue to exist in name for another century and a half, but it was now what Voltaire would later describe it as: neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. The human cost of the war was staggering and would shape German memory for centuries. Entire landscapes had been transformed, depopulated regions that would take generations to recover. Refugees wandered the roads. Orphans filled what remained of the monasteries and churches. The economic devastation was profound, setting back German development just as the maritime powers, England, France, the Netherlands, were beginning to pull ahead. The psychological scars were equally deep, creating a literature of suffering and a religious mentality that emphasized individual salvation and divine judgment. For Habsburg history, the 30 Years' War marked a watershed. The Austrian branch survived, but its ambitions had to be recalibrated. No longer could it hope to dominate Germany or impose religious conformity. Instead, it would have to focus on its hereditary lands, on defending its eastern frontiers against the Ottomans, and on developing the resources and institutions necessary for a more modern form of absolutist monarchy. The war also definitively separated the destinies of the Spanish and Austrian branches. They remained allies, but the Austrian Habsburgs could no longer count on significant Spanish support, and they would increasingly chart their own course. The peace that settled over Central Europe after 1648 was the peace of exhaustion, a recognition that the wars of religion had solved nothing and destroyed much. The passion and conviction that had sent armies marching in the name of true faith had burned itself out, leaving behind ruins and graves. The future would belong to states that could mobilize resources efficiently, maintain standing armies, and pursue rational, calculated policies rather than religious crusades. The Habsburgs would have to adapt to this new world or fade into irrelevance. That they managed to adapt, to survive, and even to flourish in the century that followed is testament to the dynasty's fundamental resilience and its ability to learn from even the most catastrophic defeats. Chapter 7. The Age of Baroque and the Ottoman Siege of Vienna. From the ashes of the 30 Years' War, a new Habsburg identity emerged in Austria, one that would reach its fullest expression in the Baroque period of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. This was an age of cultural flowering and military triumph, when Vienna transformed from a medieval fortress city into a glittering capital of art, music, and architecture, and when the Austrian Habsburgs finally turned back the Ottoman threat that had menaced Europe for more than 2 centuries. The period was marked by a confident, exuberant Catholicism, expressed through art and architecture of overwhelming grandeur, and by a more consolidated form of royal power that laid the foundations for the Austrian Empire that would dominate Central Europe in the centuries to come. The Austrian Habsburg territories in the mid-17th century were a complex patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and provinces, each with its own traditions, laws, and institutions. The Archduchy of Austria formed the core, with Vienna as its capital. To the north lay Bohemia and Moravia, forcibly re-Catholicized after the 30 Years' War, but still resentful of Habsburg rule. To the east stretched the Kingdom of Hungary, though much of it remained under Ottoman occupation. To the south were the inner Austrian territories of Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola. These lands shared a ruler but little else, and the Habsburg monarchs spent much of their energy trying to create a more unified state from these disparate parts. Emperor Leopold I, who reigned from 1658 to 1705, embodied the Baroque Habsburg spirit. He was deeply pious, almost monkish in his personal habits, devoted to long hours of prayer and religious observance. He was also a patron of the arts, particularly music, and was himself an accomplished composer. His court in Vienna became a center of European culture, attracting artists, musicians, and intellectuals from across the continent. Opera flourished under Leopold's patronage, with elaborate productions staged in the new theaters he commissioned. The Imperial Hofkapelle, the court's orchestra and choir, became one of the finest musical ensembles in Europe. The physical transformation of Vienna began during Leopold's reign and continued under his successors. The medieval city, with its narrow streets and Gothic buildings clustered within defensive walls, gave way to a more spacious, planned urban environment. Great Baroque palaces were built by the nobility, competing with each other in the grandeur of their facades and the splendor of their interiors. Churches were rebuilt or newly constructed in the Baroque style, their interiors filled with gilded altarpieces, elaborate frescoes, and dramatic sculptures that expressed the triumphant spirit of the Counter-Reformation. The greatest of the Baroque architects working in Vienna was Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, whose buildings combined classical forms with theatrical Baroque drama. His Karlskirche, built to commemorate Vienna's deliverance from the plague, featured a massive dome flanked by 2 columns modeled on Trajan's column in Rome, creating a structure that was both monumental and harmonious. His designs for the imperial summer palace at Schönbrunn, though later modified, envisioned a structure that would rival Versailles in splendor, announcing Vienna's claim to be a capital equal to Paris or Madrid. But even as Vienna flourished culturally, it faced an existential military threat. The Ottoman Empire, though past its peak of expansion, remained a formidable power. In the 1660s and 1670s, Ottoman forces renewed their pressure on Hungary, pushing westward toward Vienna itself. The Hungarian nobility, many of whom were Protestant and resentful of Habsburg religious policies, sometimes cooperated with the Ottomans, or at least refused to assist in the defense of the Habsburg domains. This combination of external threat and internal division created a crisis that would culminate in one of the most dramatic episodes in Habsburg history, the Siege of Vienna in 1683. The Ottoman campaign that culminated in the siege was led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, commanding an army that contemporary estimates placed at well over 100,000 men, though modern historians suggest the actual number was probably somewhat smaller. The Ottoman army marched through Hungary in the summer of 1683, sweeping aside the few Habsburg forces that tried to delay them. By mid-July, they had reached Vienna and began establishing their siege lines. Vienna in 1683 had a population of perhaps 50,000, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside. The city's defenses had been modernized in the previous decades, with thick walls and angular bastions designed to withstand artillery bombardment. But the garrison was small, numbering fewer than 20,000 soldiers and armed civilians, and it was commanded by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, an experienced officer who understood that the city's only hope was to hold out until relief arrived. Emperor Leopold I had fled the city before the siege began, a decision that was practically necessary. A captured emperor would have been a disaster, but which nonetheless left a bitter taste among Vienna's defenders. He established his court at Passau and worked frantically to assemble a relief army. The task was complicated by the political structure of the Holy Roman Empire, where each prince controlled his own forces and had to be individually persuaded to contribute troops. Leopold also appealed to King John III Sobieski of Poland, offering territorial concessions in exchange for Polish military assistance. The siege lasted 2 months, from mid-July to early September. The Ottomans dug trenches, erected artillery batteries, and began the slow, grinding work of breaking down the city's fortifications. They exploded mines under the walls, creating breaches that the defenders frantically worked to repair. Artillery bombardments continued day and night, smashing buildings and killing civilians. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread, and morale wavered. But Starhemberg held the garrison together, organizing constant repairs to the fortifications, launching sorties to disrupt Ottoman siege works, and maintaining discipline through force of personality and the knowledge that surrender would mean enslavement or death. By early September, the situation had become desperate. The Ottoman trenches had advanced to within yards of the walls. Major breaches had been opened in the fortifications. The garrison was exhausted, having fought off repeated assaults. Ammunition was running low. If relief did not arrive within days, Vienna would fall, and with it, the Habsburg position in Central Europe would be gravely weakened. The Ottoman Empire might then be able to push into southern Germany, threatening the very heart of Christian Europe. But relief was coming. Throughout August, forces had been gathering in the mountains northwest of Vienna. The Holy Roman Empire had contributed contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, and Franconia. Most importantly, King John III Sobieski had arrived with the Polish army, including the legendary winged hussars, heavy cavalry whose dramatic appearance, with large artificial wings attached to their armor, was designed to terrify their enemies as much as to serve any practical purpose. The The relief army numbered perhaps 60 to 70,000 men, still smaller than the Ottoman force, but rested and eager for battle. The commanders agreed on a plan. They would march down from the Vienna woods, the forested heights to the west of the city, and attack the Ottoman siege lines from the rear, relieving Vienna and destroying the Ottoman army in the process. On September 12, 1683, the Battle of Vienna began. The relief army descended from the heights in the early morning, and fighting raged throughout the day. The Ottomans, caught between the relief army and the garrison, which sallied out to attack from within the city, fought desperately but were gradually pushed back. In the late afternoon, Sobieski personally led a massive cavalry charge, perhaps the last great cavalry charge in European military history, with the Polish hussars in the van, thundering down the slopes directly into the Ottoman camp. The Ottoman lines broke, and the army fled in disorder, abandoning their siege works, their artillery, and their vast camp with all its supplies and treasure. Vienna was saved. The victory was celebrated throughout Christian Europe as a deliverance, almost miraculous, another Lepanto, another sign of divine favor. Sobieski, in a letter to the Pope, paraphrased Julius Caesar, "Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered. The Poles received much of the credit, perhaps more than was entirely fair to the German and Austrian forces, but Sobieski's charisma and his hussars' dramatic charge captured the popular imagination. The strategic consequences of the victory were enormous. The siege had been the Ottoman Empire's last great offensive in Europe. In the years that followed, Habsburg and allied forces went on the offensive, driving the Ottomans out of Hungary, recapturing Buda in 1686, pushing into the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 confirmed these gains, transferring most of Hungary to Habsburg control and marking the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long retreat from Europe. The recovery of Hungary was a demographic and religious challenge for the Habsburgs. The regions reconquered from the Ottomans were devastated and depopulated. The Habsburgs encouraged settlement, bringing in German colonists, Orthodox Serbs fleeing Ottoman rule, and other groups. The religious situation was complex, with Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians all claiming rights and privileges. The Hungarian nobility, proud and independent-minded, resented Habsburg absolutism and mounted several rebellions in the early 18th century. Integrating Hungary into the Habsburg domains would be a work of generations, never entirely successful, always a source of tension. But the victory at Vienna and the subsequent reconquest of Hungary established the Austrian Habsburgs as a great European power in their own right, no longer overshadowed by their Spanish cousins. Vienna became one of the great capitals of Europe, a city of palaces and churches, of music and learning, where the Baroque style reached its fullest and most exuberant expression. The Habsburgs patronized Italian architects, Flemish painters, German musicians, creating a court culture that synthesized influences from across Europe. This was the Vienna of which Mozart and Haydn would later be a part. The Vienna of coffeehouses and balls, of elaborate court ceremonial and sophisticated intellectual life. The Baroque period also saw the consolidation of Habsburg power within their territories. The nobility, once proud and independent, were gradually transformed into a court aristocracy, dependent on imperial favor, competing for positions and honors rather than challenging royal authority. The bureaucracy expanded, creating a more efficient system of administration and taxation. A standing army was maintained, trained, and disciplined, capable of projecting Habsburg power beyond their borders. The institutions of the modern Austrian state were taking shape, preparing the ground for the centralized monarchy that would emerge more fully in the 18th century. Chapter 8. The War of the Spanish Succession. The end of the Spanish line. While the Austrian Habsburgs flourished in the late 17th century, their Spanish cousins faced mounting crises. The Spanish branch of the dynasty, which had dominated European politics for a century and a half, was approaching its end in a manner that was both pathetic and inevitable. The final Spanish Habsburg ruler, Charles II, was the product of generations of inbreeding, a living testament to the dangers of the dynasty's marriage strategy when taken to its logical extreme. His reign, from 1665 to 1700, was marked by declining Spanish power, military defeats, and territorial losses. And his death without an heir would plunge Europe into yet another devastating war as the great powers fought to determine who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. Charles II was born in 1661, the only surviving son of Philip IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. The marriage between Philip and Mariana was itself an example of Habsburg intermarriage. They were uncle and niece. And Charles inherited the accumulated genetic problems of generations of such unions. The Habsburg jaw, that characteristic protrusion of the lower jaw that made eating difficult, was so pronounced in Charles that he could barely chew his food. He suffered from numerous health problems, was physically weak, was slow in his mental development, and was widely believed to be impotent, unable to produce an heir. When Philip IV died in 1665, Charles became king at the age of 4. His mother served as regent, but she was neither intelligent nor energetic, and effective power fell to court favorites and factions who used their positions for personal enrichment rather than the good of the kingdom. Spain, already in decline, continued to weaken. Military defeats mounted. The Portuguese rebellion, which had begun in 1640, ended successfully in 1668 with Portuguese independence. The French, under the aggressive Louis XIV, seized Spanish territories in the Spanish Netherlands and along the Spanish-French border. The Spanish Navy, once the most powerful in the world, declined into irrelevance. Charles reached his majority and assumed personal rule, but he was incapable of providing effective leadership. He was superstitious, easily influenced, and subject to fits of melancholy and religious mania. He married twice, first to a French princess, and then to a German one, but both marriages were childless. The question of the succession became the dominant issue of European politics. Spain and its empire, which still included vast territories in the Americas, the Spanish Netherlands, and Spanish possessions in Italy, would pass to whoever Charles named as his heir. The two main claimants were a French prince, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV through Louis's marriage to Charles II's half-sister, Maria Theresa, and an Austrian archduke, Charles, younger son of Emperor Leopold I. The French claim was closer in blood, but the Austrian claim represented continuity of the Habsburg line. Each side had supporters within Spain, and European diplomats worked frantically to negotiate a partition treaty that would divide the Spanish inheritance without war. Several such treaties were negotiated, but they depended on Charles II agreeing to them, and he refused, insisting that the Spanish Empire must remain intact under a single ruler. Charles II finally died on November 1st, 1700, aged 38 but looking far older, worn out by his various ailments and by the burdens of a kingship he had never been equipped to bear. His final will, influenced by Spanish grandees who feared French power, but also recognized the weakness of the Austrian alternative, named Philip of Anjou as his heir, on the condition that the French and Spanish crowns never be united under a single ruler. Louis XIV accepted the will on his grandson's behalf, and Philip traveled to Madrid to be proclaimed King Philip V of Spain. But Louis XIV's subsequent actions made war inevitable. He refused to renounce Philip's place in the French line of succession. He moved French troops into the Spanish Netherlands, threatening the Dutch Republic. He began treating Spanish America as a French sphere of influence. The other European powers, especially England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria, concluded that French control of the Spanish Empire would create a French hegemony that would threaten all of Europe. They formed a grand alliance and declared war in 1701, beginning the War of the Spanish Succession. The war lasted for 13 years and was fought across Europe and in the colonies. It was a war of shifting alliances and complex negotiations, of great battles and sieges, of economic exhaustion and mounting casualties. The military campaigns were dominated by two brilliant commanders: the Duke of Marlborough, leading the Anglo-Dutch forces, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, leading the Austrian forces. Marlborough and Eugene formed an effective partnership, winning a series of major victories against the French and their Bavarian allies. At Blenheim in 1704, Marlborough and Eugene inflicted a crushing defeat on a combined French and Bavarian army, saving Vienna from French conquest and demonstrating that French military power was not invincible. At Ramillies in 1706, Marlborough destroyed a French army in the Spanish Netherlands, liberating much of that territory from French control. At Oudenarde in 1708 and Malplaquet in 1709, the Allied forces continued their string of victories, pushing deep into French territory and threatening Paris itself. But military victories did not translate easily into political settlement. The Allies insisted that Philip V renounce the Spanish throne, but Philip, supported by the Spanish people who preferred a Bourbon king to renewed Austrian Habsburg rule, refused. The war dragged on, becoming increasingly unpopular in England and the Netherlands as the costs mounted and the initial war aims seemed further from achievement than ever. The death of Emperor Joseph IV in 1711 complicated matters further. His brother Charles, the Austrian claimant to the Spanish throne, inherited the Austrian domains and was elected Holy Roman Emperor as Charles VI. Now the Allies faced an awkward question. Was a union of Spain and Austria under Charles VI any more acceptable than a union of Spain and France under the Bourbons? The diplomatic situation was transformed by political changes in England. The Whig government that had prosecuted the war vigorously fell from power, replaced by Tories who were eager for peace. Secret negotiations began between England and France, much to the fury of the Dutch and the Austrians, who felt betrayed by their ally. The result was the Peace of Utrecht, signed in 1713, followed by supplementary treaties in the following years that brought the War of the Spanish Succession to a close. The settlement was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but was acceptable to all as preferable to continued war. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain and retained the Spanish Empire in the Americas, but he renounced any claim to the French throne, ensuring that France and Spain would remain separate. The Spanish territories in Europe were divided among the victors. The Austrian Habsburgs received the Spanish Netherlands, which became the Austrian Netherlands, as well as the Spanish territories in Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, and the island of Sardinia, later exchanged for Sicily. Great Britain received Gibraltar and Minorca, strategic bases in the Mediterranean, and secured favorable trading rights with Spanish America. For the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family, the War of the Spanish Succession marked its definitive end. After nearly 2 centuries of rule, after the glories of Charles V and Philip II, after the wealth of the American silver fleets and the grandeur of the Escorial, the Spanish Habsburgs were no more. Their final representative, Charles II, had been unable to perpetuate the line, and their territories were now divided among rival powers and dynasties. The Spanish throne passed to the Bourbons, and although Spain remained a significant power, it would never again dominate Europe as it had in the 16th century. For the Austrian Habsburgs, the outcome was more favorable than it might have appeared. They had lost Spain itself, but they had gained valuable territories in Italy and the Netherlands. More importantly, they had established themselves as one of the great powers of Europe, capable of fighting major wars, maintaining large armies, and influencing European affairs. The Austrian Netherlands brought wealth and access to North Sea trade. The Italian territories gave them dominance in the Italian peninsula and control of strategic Alpine passes, and their position in Central Europe, secured by the reconquest of Hungary and their retention of the imperial title, made them a counterweight to French power. The war also accelerated changes in warfare and statecraft that would define the 18th century. Standing armies became the norm, with professional soldiers trained in standardized tactics and equipped with increasingly sophisticated weapons. Logistics and supply systems became more organized, allowing armies to operate more effectively over longer campaigns. Diplomacy became more calculating, less driven by religious or dynastic sentiment, and more by pragmatic assessments of national interest. The balance of power became a guiding principle of European international relations, with all the major powers seeking to prevent any one state from becoming too dominant. The personal cost of the war was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died in battle or from disease. Civilian populations in war zones suffered from pillage, devastation, and economic disruption. The financial burden left all the major powers deeply in debt, setting the stage for fiscal crises that would plague governments throughout the century. The war confirmed what the 30 Years' War had suggested, that large-scale European wars were immensely destructive and could rarely achieve decisive results. Statesmen would spend the next century trying to manage international relations in ways that avoided such catastrophic conflicts, with decidedly mixed success. For Habsburg history, the end of the Spanish line and the resolution of the succession crisis marked a clear dividing line. The age of Habsburg universal monarchy, when it had seemed possible that a single dynasty might rule all of Catholic Europe and much of the Americas, was definitively over. The Austrian Habsburgs would continue as a great European dynasty, but they would be one great power among several, not a would-be universal monarchy. They would have to compete with France, with Britain, with Prussia, with Russia, playing the diplomatic and military games that characterized 18th century international relations. And they would have to confront new challenges, including the rise of nationalism, the spread of Enlightenment ideas, and the emergence of new powers that would eventually challenge the very foundations of dynastic rule. Chapter 9. Maria Theresa, the Empress who defied Europe. In the history of the Habsburg Dynasty, few figures shine as brightly or as unexpectedly as Maria Theresa, who ruled the Habsburg domains from 1740 to 1780. She was not supposed to rule at all. Habsburg law and custom, like that of most European states, excluded women from sovereign power. But the extinction of the male line, combined with her father's determination and her own formidable abilities, placed her on the throne at a moment of supreme crisis. Her reign would transform the Habsburg monarchy, modernizing its institutions, strengthening its military, and establishing it as one of the great powers of Europe. And she would do all this while bearing 16 children, managing a vast household, and maintaining the dignity and ceremonial splendor expected of an 18th century monarch. Maria Theresa was born in 1717, the eldest surviving child of Emperor Charles VI. Her father, having no male heirs after the death of his only son in infancy, had spent decades trying to ensure that his domains would pass intact to Maria Theresa. The legal instrument he created for this purpose was the Pragmatic Sanction, proclaimed in 1713 and subsequently recognized by the various Habsburg territories, and through intensive diplomatic efforts, by most of the major European powers. The Pragmatic Sanction established that the Habsburg domains were indivisible and could pass to a female heir if no male heir existed. But diplomatic promises, Maria Theresa would discover, meant little when backed by neither force nor interest. When Charles XII died suddenly in October 1740, his daughter was 23 years old, married to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, whom her father had forced to exchange his duchy for the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Mother of 3 small children, and almost entirely unprepared for the maelstrom she was about to enter. She had received some education in history and languages, but had been largely excluded from government affairs. She knew little about the complex administration of the Habsburg territories, less about military matters, and nothing about the brutal calculations of power politics that would immediately confront her. Within weeks of her accession, the vultures began to circle. King Frederick II of Prussia, who had just inherited his throne from his father, saw an opportunity to seize the wealthy province of Silesia from Austria. In December 1740, without any declaration of war or pretense of legal justification, Prussian armies invaded Silesia. Frederick, who would become known as Frederick the Great, offered Maria Theresa a cynical bargain. He would support her claim to the Habsburg inheritance in exchange for Silesia. When she refused, citing the sacred nature of her inheritance and her duty to her subjects, Frederick simply took Silesia by force, defeating Austrian armies at Mollwitz in April 1741. Frederick's aggression encouraged others. France, always eager to weaken the Habsburgs, formed an alliance with Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony. The Elector of Bavaria claimed the Habsburg inheritance for himself, based on ancient treaties and genealogical arguments. Spanish and Bavarian armies invaded Austria from the south and west. By early 1741, the Habsburg monarchy seemed on the verge of collapse, about to be partitioned among its enemies like a carcass divided by scavengers. But Maria Theresa proved far more resilient than her enemies expected. Denied access to the imperial title, which went to the Bavarian elector, who briefly became Emperor Charles VII, unable to count on significant help from Britain, which was more concerned with its colonial rivalry with France, she turned to her own resources and her own subjects. In one of the most dramatic moments of her reign, she traveled to Pressburg, modern Bratislava, in September 1741, to appeal to the Hungarian Diet for support. The Hungarian nobility, never entirely reconciled to Habsburg rule, had been considering whether to support Bavaria's claim. Maria Theresa appeared before them, dressed in mourning, carrying her infant son, Joseph, the future emperor, and made an impassioned appeal. She spoke in Latin, as Hungarian protocol required, describing the desperate situation, reminding them of their oaths of loyalty, and appealing to their honor as warriors and nobles. According to legend, and the story has been embellished over the centuries, the Hungarian nobles, moved by her courage and beauty, drew their swords and cried, "Moriamur pro rege nostro Maria Theresia." Let us die for our king, Maria Theresa. Whether the scene was quite that dramatic is uncertain, but the Hungarians did pledge their support, providing troops that would be crucial in the wars that followed. The War of the Austrian Succession raged from 1740 to 1748, fought across Europe from Silesia to Italy, from Bavaria to the Netherlands. Maria Theresa's forces, initially overwhelmed and poorly led, gradually improved. She found capable commanders, reformed the army's administration, and exploited divisions among her enemies. When Charles VII died in 1745, the way was clear for Maria Theresa's husband to be elected emperor as Francis I, restoring the imperial dignity to the Habsburg family. Though Maria Theresa remained the real power, ruling the Habsburg hereditary lands in her own right. The Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 ended the war with a settlement that confirmed Maria Theresa's hold on most of her inheritance. But it also confirmed Frederick's conquest of Silesia, a loss that Maria Theresa never accepted and always hoped to reverse. Silesia was wealthy, populous, and strategically important, and its loss rankled deeply. Maria Theresa's determination to recover Silesia would drive much of her foreign policy for the next 2 decades. With peace established, Maria Theresa turned to internal reform with an energy that was remarkable. She recognized that her monarchy had nearly collapsed because its institutions were outdated, its administration inefficient, and its military inadequate. Working with capable advisors, particularly Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Haugwitz and later Prince Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, she implemented sweeping changes. The administrative structure of the monarchy was rationalized. Central government offices were created to coordinate policy across the various Habsburg territories. The chaotic tax system was reformed, with nobles and clergy losing many of their traditional exemptions, increasing state revenue significantly. The army was reorganized with better training, more reliable supply systems, and improved command structures. A professional bureaucracy was developed, staffed by educated officials selected on merit rather than birth alone. Education reform was another priority. Maria Theresa established a system of state-sponsored elementary education, making basic schooling available to more children than ever before. She reformed universities, founded military and technical schools, and encouraged the development of scientific and practical knowledge. These reforms were driven partly by enlightened principles. Maria Theresa corresponded with philosophers and read widely, but also by pragmatic concerns about training capable administrators and officers for state service. Religious policy was more conservative, reflecting Maria Theresa's deep personal piety. She remained committed to Catholicism and was uncomfortable with religious tolerance. Jews faced discrimination and periodic expulsions from Vienna, though these policies were often reversed when advisors pointed out their economic costs. Protestants were pressured to convert, and religious uniformity was encouraged. Yet even here, pragmatism tempered principle. In territories with large Protestant populations, outright persecution was avoided as counterproductive. Maria Theresa's personal life was remarkable for its combination of public grandeur and private domesticity. She bore 16 children between 1737 and 1756, a testament to both her physical constitution and her sense of dynastic duty. She was devoted to her husband, Francis, and his death in 1765 devastated her. She went into deep mourning, wore black for the rest of her life, and had her rooms draped in black. Yet she continued to rule, refusing to let personal grief interfere with state business. Her relationships with her children were complex. She was an affectionate mother, but also demanding, particularly regarding her daughters' marriages, which she arranged with careful attention to political advantage. Her eldest son, Joseph, who became co-ruler after Francis's death, had a difficult relationship with his mother. They disagreed on many issues, with Joseph favoring more radical reforms and religious tolerance, while Maria Theresa preferred more cautious, conservative policies. Yet they managed to work together, with Maria Theresa retaining ultimate authority until her death. The diplomatic revolution of 1756, orchestrated by Kaunitz, was one of the most dramatic reversals in European diplomatic history. For more than 2 centuries, France and the Habsburgs had been enemies, fighting each other repeatedly in Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany. Now, driven by their shared fear of rising Prussian power, they became allies. The alliance was sealed by the marriage of Maria Theresa's youngest daughter, Marie Antoinette, to the French Dauphin. the future Louis XVI. This reversal of alliances shocked Europe and demonstrated the increasing pragmatism of 18th-century diplomacy, where traditional enmities counted for less than current calculations of advantage. The alliance led to the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, another attempt to recover Silesia from Frederick the Great. Despite the alliance with France and Russia, despite initial military successes, the war ended with Silesia still in Prussian hands. Frederick, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, survived through brilliant generalship, good fortune, and British subsidies. The Peace of Hubertusburg in 1763 confirmed the status quo, and Maria Theresa finally, reluctantly, accepted that Silesia was lost forever. The final years of Maria Theresa's reign were marked by continued reform and by the first partition of Poland in 1772, in which Austria, Prussia, and Russia divided parts of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth among themselves. Maria Theresa participated reluctantly, troubled by the immorality of partitioning a neighboring state, but unwilling to be left out while her rivals strengthened themselves. It was an act that illustrated the moral compromises that even the most conscientious rulers faced in the amoral world of great power politics. Maria Theresa died on November 29, 1780, at the age of 63, having ruled for 40 years. She left behind a transformed monarchy, stronger, more efficient, and more capable of competing with its rivals than it had been when she inherited it. She had defied the expectations of those who had thought a woman incapable of ruling, had held her inheritance together through the most severe crisis, and had established herself as one of the great monarchs of European history. The Habsburg monarchy she bequeathed to her son, Joseph II, was not the universal monarchy of Charles V or the Baroque splendor of Leopold the Further, but it was a viable, modern state, capable of enduring into the turbulent 19th century that lay ahead. Chapter 10. The Twilight of the Empire. Franz Joseph and the Age of Nationalism. By the mid-19th century, the Habsburg monarchy had survived the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Congress of Vienna's attempt to restore the old order. It remained one of the great powers of Europe, ruling over a vast territory that stretched from northern Italy to the borders of Russia, from Bohemia to the Adriatic. But it was an empire increasingly out of step with its times, holding together through imperial tradition and bureaucratic efficiency, a collection of peoples who were developing new national consciousnesses and new aspirations for self-determination. The long reign of Emperor Franz Joseph III from 1848 to 1916 would be marked by the constant struggle to preserve this multinational empire against the centrifugal forces of nationalism, liberalism, and modernity. Franz Joseph was born in 1830, the eldest son of Archduke Francis Charles and Princess Sophie of Bavaria. His childhood was shaped by the rigid protocol of the Habsburg court, and by his mother's strong personality and conservative political views. He was trained for rulership from an early age, educated in languages. He would eventually speak German, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, and Italian fluently, military affairs, history, and statecraft. He developed habits of discipline and duty that would characterize his entire life, rising before dawn, working at his desk for hours, attending to the endless details of government with methodical precision. He became emperor unexpectedly in December 1848, at the age of 18, when his uncle Ferdinand I abdicated during the revolutionary upheavals that swept across Europe that year. The decision to bypass his father in favor of the younger, more energetic Franz Joseph was made by the conservative faction at court, led by his mother, who believed that only a new, untainted ruler could restore Habsburg authority. The young emperor inherited a monarchy in crisis. Italy was in revolt, Hungary had declared independence, Vienna itself had seen barricades in the streets and the assassination of the war minister. The task before him was to restore order and reassert imperial authority. The restoration was achieved through military force. Austrian armies, supported by Russian troops who intervened at Austria's request, crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1849. The Italian territories were reconquered. Liberal constitutional reforms were revoked, and a period of neo-absolutism began, with Franz Joseph ruling through his ministers and a centralized bureaucracy, suppressing political dissent and nationalist movements. For a decade, the Habsburg monarchy seemed to have successfully restored the old order, but appearances were deceptive. The defeats of the 1850s and 1860s shattered Austrian pretensions to great power status. In 1859, Austria fought France and Piedmont Sardinia in Italy and was defeated at the battles of Magenta and Solferino. The resulting peace cost Austria most of its Italian territories, marking the beginning of Italian unification under Piedmont. In 1866, Austria fought Prussia over influence in Germany and was decisively defeated at the Battle of Königgrätz, Sadova. This defeat expelled Austria from German affairs, paving the way for Prussian dominance and the eventual unification of Germany under Prussian leadership in 1871. These military defeats forced Franz Joseph to compromise with the most restive of his subjects, the Hungarians. The result was the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1877, which transformed the Habsburg monarchy into a dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary became separate kingdoms, each with its own government, parliament, and administration, united only through the person of the emperor-king. Franz Joseph was Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. A common foreign policy, a unified military, and shared ministries of war and finance. This arrangement satisfied Hungarian national aspirations while maintaining the unity of the monarchy, but it created new problems. The Slavic peoples of the empire, Czechs, Poles, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, resented Hungarian dominance and demanded similar recognition, which was never granted. Franz Joseph's personal life was marked by tragedy. In 1854, he married Elizabeth of Bavaria, known as Sisi, a beautiful, romantic, and deeply unconventional woman who chafed against the rigid formality of the Habsburg court. Their relationship was complex and often strained. Sisi preferred travel, particularly to Hungary and Greece, to the tedious ceremonial duties of an empress. She became increasingly reclusive, obsessed with maintaining her beauty, and emotionally fragile. Yet Franz Joseph loved her deeply, and her assassination by an Italian anarchist in 1898 was a devastating blow from which he never fully recovered. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was intelligent, liberal in his politics, and increasingly at odds with his conservative father. Rudolf's marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was unhappy, and he became involved in a scandalous relationship with Baroness Mary Wetzera. In January 1889, Rudolf and Mary were found dead at the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Meierling in an apparent murder-suicide. The exact circumstances remain unclear despite extensive investigation, but the death of the heir to the throne was a catastrophe for the dynasty, and a personal tragedy that haunted Franz Joseph for the rest of his life. The new heir became Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a man of strong will and reformist ideas, who believed the dual monarchy should be transformed into a triple monarchy, giving Slavic peoples equal status with Austrians and Hungarians. His plans alarmed both Austrian Germans, who feared losing their dominant position, and Hungarians, who opposed any dilution of their power. Franz Ferdinand married Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess, in a morganatic marriage that scandalized the court but demonstrated his willingness to defy convention. Their assassination in Sarajevo in June 1914 would trigger the catastrophe that would destroy everything Franz Joseph had spent his life trying to preserve. Vienna, in Franz Joseph's reign, was a city of extraordinary cultural vitality, despite, or perhaps because of, the political tensions of the empire. This was the Vienna of Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele in art, of Gustav Mahler in music, of Sigmund Freud in psychology, of Arthur Schnitzler in literature. The Ringstrasse, a grand boulevard built on the site of the old city walls, was lined with magnificent buildings in various historical styles, neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance, neo-Baroque, expressing both confidence and nostalgia. Coffeehouses became centers of intellectual life, where writers, artists, and thinkers gathered to discuss ideas, read newspapers, and play chess. But beneath the cultural brilliance, deeper problems festered. The various nationalities of the empire, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Italians, increasingly defined themselves in opposition to each other rather than as part of a common imperial identity. Language became a battleground, with fierce disputes over which languages should be used in schools, courts, and administration. Political parties organized along national lines, and parliamentary sessions often descended into chaos, with deputies shouting at each other in different languages, sometimes physically fighting. The economy of the empire was developing but unevenly. Bohemia became industrialized, with factories, mines, and a growing working class. Vienna remained a great commercial and financial center, but Hungary remained largely agricultural, dominated by a landed aristocracy resistant to modernization. The Slavic territories, particularly Galicia in the north and the southern Slav lands, were poor and underdeveloped. Social tensions increased as industrialization created new classes, an industrial bourgeoisie and an urban proletariat, whose interests clashed with those of the traditional aristocracy and peasantry. Franz Joseph attempted to hold this diverse empire together through the prestige of the dynasty, the efficiency of the bureaucracy, and the loyalty of the army. He presented himself as the father of his peoples, standing above national divisions, embodying continuity and tradition. He maintained a grueling work schedule into his 80s, rising at 4 a.m, spending hours at his desk reviewing documents, receiving ministers and officials, attending military reviews and court ceremonies. He dressed in military uniform almost always, projecting an image of duty and discipline. He avoided innovation and change, believing that the monarchy's strength lay in its traditions and that the nationalist and democratic movements that threatened it would eventually exhaust themselves if the dynasty held firm. But history was moving against him. The rise of mass politics, the spread of education and literacy, the development of newspapers and other forms of mass communication all strengthened national movements. Socialist parties organized the growing working class along class rather than national lines, but still threatened the established order. Pan-Slavism, the idea that all Slavic peoples should unite, attracted many South Slavs within the empire and received support from Russia, creating a new external threat. And in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire's retreat created a power vacuum that drew in Austria, Russia, and the small Balkan nations in a complex web of rivalries and alliances that would prove catastrophic. By the early 20th century, the Habsburg monarchy was widely seen as anachronistic, a relic of an earlier age that somehow continued to function despite all the forces working against it. Foreign observers marveled at its survival while predicting its imminent collapse. Franz Joseph himself, now in his 80s, white-bearded and stooped, seemed a figure from the past, presiding over an empire that increasingly belonged to history rather than the future. Yet it endured, held together by inertia, by the self-interest of its ruling classes, by the lack of any clear alternative that would satisfy all the competing national groups, and by the old emperor's stubborn determination to fulfill the duty he had accepted as an 18-year-old boy in 1848. Chapter 11. The Final Spark, Sarajevo and the Great War. The final chapter of the Habsburg Dynasty began with 2 gunshots on a sunny morning in Sarajevo, and ended 4 years later in the smoking ruins of a continent-wide catastrophe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie on June 28, 1914, was not the cause of World War I. The causes were far deeper, rooted in the complex alliance systems, imperial rivalries, arms races, and nationalist tensions that had built up over decades. But it was the spark that ignited the powder keg. And in the war that followed, the Habsburg monarchy, that centuries-old structure that had survived so many crises, finally collapsed under stresses it could no longer bear. Franz Ferdinand had traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, to observe military maneuvers. Bosnia had been part of the Ottoman Empire until 1878, when the Congress of Berlin placed it under Austrian administration, and Austria-Hungary formally annexed it in 1908. This annexation outraged Serbian nationalists who believed that Bosnia, with its large Serbian population, should be part of a greater Serbian state. Various secret societies, supported or at least tolerated by elements within the Serbian government and military, worked to undermine Austrian rule and promote the cause of South Slav unity under Serbian leadership. The date of Franz Ferdinand's visit was symbolically charged. June 28th was Vidovdan, St. Vitus's Day, an important date in Serbian national consciousness, commemorating the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Serbian forces were defeated by the Ottomans. To choose this date for a visit by the heir to the Austrian throne to a territory with a large Serbian population was either remarkably insensitive or deliberately provocative, depending on one's perspective. The assassination plot was organized by a group of young Bosnian Serbs connected to a secret society called the Black Hand, which had ties to Serbian military intelligence. Several assassins were positioned along the Archduke's route. The first attempt, a bomb thrown at the Archduke's car, failed, injuring people in a following car, but leaving Franz Ferdinand and Sophie unharmed. After attending a ceremony at City Hall, where Franz Ferdinand delivered a speech while still shaken by the attempt on his life, the couple decided to visit the injured in the hospital. Due to confusion about the route and a wrong turn by the driver, the Archduke's car ended up stopped directly in front of one of the conspirators, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, who was sitting in a cafe, believing the mission had failed. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots from his Browning pistol at close range. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The other hit Sophie in the abdomen. Both died within minutes. Franz Ferdinand's last words were reportedly, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die, live for our children." But Sophie had already lost consciousness and died soon after. Princip was immediately seized by the crowd and arrested. The news reached Vienna that evening. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had never been close to his nephew and had disapproved of his morganatic marriage, received the news with apparent calm, reportedly saying, "A higher power has restored the order that I unfortunately was unable to maintain." But the implications were immediately clear to the Austrian government. This was not merely an assassination, but an act of Serbian-sponsored terrorism, an intolerable challenge to the monarchy's authority and prestige that required a strong response. The month that followed the assassination, July 1914, has been analyzed by historians with microscopic attention examining every diplomatic communication, every cabinet meeting, every decision point where the slide toward war might have been stopped. The Austrian government, with the encouragement of Germany, which pledged unconditional support through the infamous blank check, decided to use the crisis to crush Serbia once and for all. An ultimatum was delivered to Serbia on July 23rd, with terms deliberately designed to be unacceptable. Among other demands, Austrian officials were to be allowed to operate on Serbian territory to investigate the assassination and suppress anti-Austrian activities. Serbia's reply on July 25th accepted most of the demands, but rejected the provision that would violate its sovereignty. Austria-Hungary judged the response insufficient and declared war on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination. Austrian artillery began bombarding Belgrade. But this was not to be a localized Balkan conflict. Russia, viewing itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and unwilling to abandon Serbia, began mobilizing its armies. Germany, fearing encirclement by Russia and France, demanded that Russia cease mobilization. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France on August 3rd, implementing the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a rapid defeat of France through an invasion via Belgium before turning to face Russia. Britain, which had defensive treaty obligations to Belgium and strategic interests in preventing German domination of the continent, declared war on Germany on August 4th. Within a week of Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia, the great powers of Europe were mobilizing millions of men, and a continent-wide conflict had begun. The alliance systems that were supposed to preserve peace through deterrence had instead ensured that a regional crisis became a global catastrophe. The war that followed bore little resemblance to the expectations of those who began it. Military planners on all sides anticipated a short, decisive conflict, over by Christmas, settled by great battles of maneuver and elan. Instead, the war settled into grinding attrition, with vast armies facing each other across networks of trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border in the west, and across the plains of Poland and Russia in the east. New technologies, machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, tanks, aircraft, made warfare more deadly than ever before. Casualty figures that would have been unthinkable in previous conflicts became routine. For Austria-Hungary, the war was a disaster from the beginning. The initial invasion of Serbia in August 1914 was repulsed with heavy losses. Austrian forces had to retreat, and Belgrade was briefly occupied by the Serbs. Only with German assistance would Serbia finally be conquered in 1915. On the Eastern Front, Austrian armies faced Russia and fared poorly. Russian forces invaded Galicia, defeating Austrian armies at Lemberg and threatening to break through into Hungary. Hundreds of thousands of Austrian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the first months of fighting. Only German intervention stabilized the situation, but at the cost of Austrian independence. Increasingly, Austrian forces operated under German command, and Austrian policy was subordinated to German strategy. In May 1915, Italy, which had been allied with Austria-Hungary before the war, declared war on Austria and opened a new front along the Alpine border. For the next 3 years, Italian and Austrian forces fought a brutal series of battles in the mountains, attacking and counterattacking over the same rocky ground, suffering hundreds of thousands of casualties for minimal gains. The Isonzo River became synonymous with futile slaughter, as 11 successive battles were fought there between 1915 and 1917. Emperor Franz Joseph lived to see only the first 2 years of this catastrophe. In his final years, he continued his routines, rising early, working at his desk, attending to state business with the same methodical attention to detail he had maintained for nearly 7 decades. But he was exhausted. worn down by age, by personal tragedies, by the burdens of a war he had not wanted but felt compelled to fight. He died on November 21, 1916, at the age of 86, having reigned for 68 years, one of the longest reigns in European history. His death removed one of the few remaining symbols of continuity and stability in an empire that was rapidly disintegrating. His successor was his grandnephew Charles, who became Emperor Charles III of Austria and King Charles IV of Hungary. Charles was young, only 29, idealistic, and genuinely concerned about the suffering the war was causing. He made secret attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies, offering concessions including the cession of Austrian territories. These efforts, when discovered, outraged Germany and fatally compromised Charles's position. He also attempted internal reforms, granting amnesty to political prisoners, recalling Parliament, promising greater autonomy to the various national groups. But these measures came too late and were too little. By 1918, the Habsburg Empire was collapsing from within. Food shortages caused starvation in the cities. Strikes and demonstrations became common. The army, which had held together despite enormous casualties and hardships, was disintegrating as soldiers deserted to return home or to join national movements. The various peoples of the empire were organizing their own national councils and declaring independence. Czechs and Slovaks proclaimed the Czechoslovak Republic on October 28th. South Slavs formed the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which would join with Serbia to create Yugoslavia. Hungary declared independence. The empire was simply ceasing to exist, fragmenting into its component national parts. Austria-Hungary signed an armistice with the Allies on November 3, 1918. Charles, realizing that his position was hopeless, issued a proclamation on November 11th, recognizing Austria's right to determine its own form of government, essentially abdicating without formally using that word. He withdrew from the exercise of state affairs, but refused to formally renounce his titles, hoping that he might somehow be restored. He made 2 attempts to reclaim the Hungarian throne in 1921, both of which failed. He died in exile on the island of Madeira in 1922, at the age of 34, the last Habsburg ruler, ending a dynasty that had ruled for more than 600 years. The war's final toll on the Habsburg lands was staggering. More than 1 million soldiers from Austria-Hungary died in the fighting. The economy was shattered, the currency worthless, infrastructure destroyed. The successor states that emerged from the empire's ruins, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and portions incorporated into Italy, Poland, and Romania, faced enormous challenges rebuilding in a continent exhausted by war. The peace treaties imposed harsh terms, particularly on Austria and Hungary, forbidding their union and imposing reparations payments. Vienna, once the capital of an empire of 50 million, became the oversized capital of a small Alpine republic of 6 million, its grand buildings and boulevards seeming anachronistic in the reduced circumstances. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the Double-Headed Eagle and the Gentle Fade. And so we arrive at the end of our long journey through Habsburg history, from the Hawk's Castle in medieval Switzerland to the final tragic dissolution in the aftermath of the Great War. The double-headed eagle, that symbol the Habsburgs had adopted from Byzantine tradition, representing an empire that looked both east and west, has been folded away into history books and museum displays. The dynasty that once ruled territories on which the sun never set has passed into memory, leaving behind monuments, memories, and questions about the nature of power, the forces of history, and the fate of empires. The Habsburg legacy is complex and contested. In the territories they once ruled, memories of Habsburg rule vary dramatically depending on national perspective and historical experience. For some, the Habsburg period represents oppression, the suppression of national aspirations, the dominance of German and later Hungarian elites over Slavic and other peoples. For others, it represents a golden age of cultural flourishing, a cosmopolitan empire that, for all its faults, allowed different peoples to coexist, that patronized arts and learning, that created a space where Czech musicians, Jewish writers, Polish nobles, and Italian architects could all find a place. Both perspectives contain truth, and the full picture is more nuanced than either extreme suggests. The architectural legacy is perhaps the most visible. Vienna remains a monument to Habsburg grandeur, its Baroque churches and palaces, its Ringstrasse boulevards, its parks and monuments all testifying to centuries of imperial patronage. The Hofburg Palace, expanded and rebuilt by successive emperors, now houses museums where tourists walk through rooms where empires were governed and dynasties rose and fell. The Schönbrunn Palace, with its formal gardens and painted ceilings, preserves the memory of Maria Theresa's court. The Karlskirche and St. Stephen's Cathedral anchored the city's skyline, linking present to past. But the Habsburg architectural legacy extends far beyond Vienna. In Prague, the Hradčany Castle complex looms over the city, a reminder of centuries when Czech kings were Habsburg emperors. In Budapest, the Hungarian Parliament building, though constructed in the late 19th century, reflects the grandeur and the tensions of the dual monarchy. In Innsbruck, in Graz, in Trieste, in Krakow, in Ljubljana, Habsburg buildings still stand, some maintained as museums, others repurposed for modern uses, all bearing witness to a vanished world. The cultural legacy is equally profound. The Habsburg courts were great patrons of music, and the musical tradition they fostered produced some of the greatest composers in Western history. Haydn served the Esterházy family, Hungarian nobles who were pillars of the Habsburg aristocracy. Mozart sought patronage from Emperor Joseph II and composed works for Habsburg celebrations. Beethoven dedicated works to Habsburg archdukes. Schubert, Brahms, Mahler, Bruckner, all were products of the musical culture that flourished in Habsburg Vienna. The tradition of Viennese classical music, of the waltz, of opera, all bear the imprint of centuries of imperial patronage. The administrative legacy is less visible, but perhaps more enduring. The Habsburg Empire, particularly in its later centuries, developed sophisticated bureaucratic systems for managing a diverse, multilingual state. The idea that government should be conducted by trained professionals following established procedures, that laws should apply uniformly across territories, that administration should be separate from personal rule. These principles, developed and refined by Habsburg administrators, influenced state-building across Central Europe. Many of the legal codes, administrative practices, and institutional structures of the Habsburg successor states were built on Habsburg foundations, adapted rather than discarded. The dynastic marriage strategy that had built the Habsburg Empire also left a genetic legacy that was ultimately destructive. The policy of intermarriage, designed to keep power concentrated within the family and to strengthen bonds between the Spanish and Austrian branches, led to increased inbreeding with each generation. The famous Habsburg jaw became more pronounced, genetic disorders more common, fertility declined, and the physical and mental health of dynasty members suffered. Charles II of Spain, unable to produce an heir, was perhaps the most tragic example, but he was not the only one affected. The very strategy that had built the empire contributed to its eventual extinction in the male line. The political legacy of Habsburg rule is perhaps most contested. The empire was, in its final decades, clearly unable to adapt to the forces of nationalism and democracy that were transforming Europe. The various peoples it ruled increasingly defined themselves by language, ethnicity, and national culture, rather than by loyalty to a dynasty. The Habsburg response, attempting to preserve a multinational empire through dynastic loyalty, bureaucratic efficiency, and occasional military force, proved inadequate. The empire's collapse in 1918 seemed to confirm that the age of dynastic empires was over, that the future belonged to nation-states. Yet, in retrospect, some historians have suggested that the Habsburg model of multinational empire, for all its problems, offered something that the successor nation-states did not: a framework within which different peoples could coexist without one dominating the others. The successor states that emerged from the Habsburg Empire, particularly Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, were themselves multinational, and they struggled with many of the same tensions that had plagued the empire. The ethnic conflicts, population transfers, and genocides that scarred Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century have led some to look back at the Habsburg Empire with a certain nostalgia, as a missed opportunity for a different kind of political organization. This nostalgia must be tempered with realism. The Habsburg Empire was not a liberal democracy. It was an authoritarian monarchy where power was concentrated at the top and where political participation was limited. The various peoples of the empire did not have equal status or equal opportunities. Nationalism was not simply imposed from outside, but grew from genuine grievances and aspirations. The empire's collapse was not merely the result of military defeat, but of internal contradictions that had become unsustainable. To romanticize Habsburg rule is to forget the very real reasons why so many of its subjects welcomed its end. What, then, should we make of this dynasty that shaped European history for more than 6 centuries? Perhaps the most striking characteristic of the Habsburgs was their extraordinary persistence. Through all the wars, succession crises, religious conflicts, and revolutionary upheavals that swept across Europe from the late Middle Ages to the 20th century, the Habsburgs endured. They adapted to changing circumstances, accepted when they could not win, compromised when necessary, and always held on to the core of their power. Their motto might have been about marriage, but their true genius was survival. They survived because they were patient. Unlike dynasties that reached for spectacular conquests and burned out quickly, the Habsburgs accumulated power gradually, built institutions slowly, and thought in terms of generations rather than individual reigns. They survived because they were pragmatic, willing to compromise on means while remaining focused on ends. They survived because they maintained legitimacy through tradition, ceremony, and the mystique of the dynasty, creating a sense that they were not merely one ruling family among many, but the embodiment of a political and social order that had divine sanction. And yet ultimately, they did not survive. The forces that destroyed the Habsburg Empire, nationalism, democracy, total war, proved too powerful for even the most persistent dynasty to resist. The world of hereditary monarchy, of dynasties ruling by divine right, of empires held together by personal loyalty to a ruling family, was passing away. The 20th century would belong to nation-states, to ideological movements, to forms of political organization that drew their legitimacy from popular sovereignty rather than ancient bloodlines. As you drift toward sleep, let your mind wander through the centuries we have traversed together. See the rough stone walls of the Hawk's Castle in Switzerland, where it all began. Watch Rudolf IV ride toward Vienna to claim his duchy, establishing the Habsburg presence in Austria that would last for more than 6 centuries. Stand in the cathedral at Ghent, where Charles V was born, to his impossible inheritance. Walk the corridors of the Escorial with Philip II, that austere king who tried to govern the world from his desk. Witness the desperate defense of Vienna against the Ottoman siege, and hear the thunder of Sobieski's hussars charging down from the heights. See Maria Theresa appeal to the Hungarian nobles, holding her infant son, refusing to accept the partition of her inheritance. Stand in the streets of Sarajevo on that fatal morning in June 1914, and hear the shots that would echo across the continent. The Habsburg story is ultimately a human story, of individuals bearing the weight of power, of families trying to secure their futures, of the constant, exhausting work of governing diverse peoples across vast territories. It is a story of magnificent achievements and terrible failures, of great art and brutal wars, of wise rulers and foolish ones, of good intentions undermined by circumstance and bad decisions leading to surprising successes. And now, as the night deepens and this long narrative draws to its close, let the story of the Habsburgs fade gently into the background of your consciousness. Let the weight of all those centuries, all those reigns, all those marriages and wars and treaties and palaces become not a burden, but a comfort. History, with all its complexity and contradiction, continues whether we attend to it or not. Empires rise and fall. Dynasties come and go. The double-headed eagle has folded its wings and passed into legend. The Habsburgs are gone, but they left their mark on the world, in stone and paint, in music and law, in the borders of nations and the memories of peoples. And in that sense they remain, not as rulers but as ghosts, shadows of a vanished world that shaped the one we inhabit today. Let those shadows be gentle ones as you drift into sleep. Let them carry you peacefully into dreams, into the quiet darkness where all history eventually flows, where the urgent concerns of emperors and the grand ambitions of dynasties dissolve into the endless, peaceful stream of time. Sleep well. The story is complete. The dynasty has ended. The long night of history continues. But for now, for you, there is only rest. Only the soft embrace of sleep. Only the gentle fade into darkness where all stories, even the longest, finally come to their quiet end.